Have you ever lain awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation that happened 3 weeks ago? Have you ever caught yourself rehearsing an argument with someone who is not even in the room with you right now? Have you ever solved the same problem 17 times in your head and still felt no closer to an answer? If any of that sounds familiar, you are not broken, you are not weak, and you are not alone in this. But you are caught in something that Buddhism identified and described with extraordinary precision 25 centuries ago. What if the anxiety you carry is not a character flaw, but a completely understandable response to a very specific kind of misunderstanding? What if the mind that overthinks is not malfunctioning, but is simply running a program it was never meant to run continuously? What if there is a way to work with that restless, looping, exhausting mind that does not require suppressing it, fixing it, or fighting it? What if the peace you are searching for is not somewhere you need to get to, but something you need to stop running away from? These questions are not rhetorical. They are the beginning of a conversation that could change the quality of every single day you live from here. Picture a pond in the middle of a forest. Perfectly still, perfectly clear, reflecting the trees and the sky above it. Now picture someone standing at the edge of that pond, throwing stone after stone into the water without stopping. The surface never settles, the reflection never clears, the depth beneath never becomes visible. That is exactly what the overthinking mind does to the underlying awareness that is trying to show itself. The stones are not the problem. The throwing without pause is the problem, and Buddhism knows precisely how to stop it. Welcome back to Wisdom Woven, where we go past the surface of ancient wisdom into the parts that actually change how you live. If you watched part 1 of this series on overthinking and anxiety, welcome back and thank you for returning. If this is your first time here, start here. You are in exactly the right place, and part 1 will be waiting for you afterward. Please like this video right now, drop a comment with the one thought that loops in your head most often, and subscribe if you have not already. Today we go deeper into what Buddhism actually prescribes for the anxious, overthinking, exhausted modern mind. Before we go any further, I want you to try something small and surprisingly powerful right now. Think of the one thought, the one specific worry or loop or recurring scenario that your mind returns to most reliably. The one that visits you at inconvenient times, that you have tried to logic away, that refuses to be resolved by thinking about it more. Write it in the comments below. Just a few words, just the shape of it, just enough to name it. Because naming it out loud to another human being, even in a comment section, is the first act of releasing it. And what you are about to hear will give you the tools to go further. Right now, people from dozens of different countries are watching this video, each of them carrying their own particular version of the same exhaustion. One person is worried about their health. Another is trapped in regret about a decision they made years ago. Someone else is running worst-case scenarios about the future so convincingly they can practically feel it happening. Your comment connects all of them. And sometimes reading that someone else is carrying the same thing is the thing that finally cracks the isolation open. So write it down, for yourself and for everyone else who is watching. We will come back to those comments, because your lived experience is always part of the teaching here, not separate from it. But now, let us talk about what the Buddha actually discovered about the anxious mind and why his findings still hold up today. He did not have a name for anxiety the way modern psychology does, but he mapped the territory with extraordinary precision. He called it the untrained mind, Chpater in Pali, and he spent his entire teaching life describing what it does and how to work with it. What he found was not what most people expect, and that unexpected finding is where everything changes. The Buddha described the untrained mind as a monkey, constantly leaping from branch to branch, never resting, never satisfied with any perch. This image has stayed alive for 25 centuries because anyone who has tried to sit quietly for 5 minutes immediately understands it with perfect clarity. The mind does not stay. It visits the past, visits the future, visits imaginary conversations and invented catastrophes, and never, not for a single moment, simply stays here. And yet here, this exact present moment, is the only place where peace has ever been or ever will be available. Everything the Buddha taught about the anxious mind points back to that single, radical, surprisingly simple observation. This is part 2 of our exploration of overthinking and anxiety through the lens of Buddhist understanding. In part 1, we covered the root causes, the 3 poisons, the nature of suffering, and why the mind creates the loop in the first place. In this video, we go deeper into the actual mechanics of how anxiety sustains itself and the precise tools Buddhism offers to interrupt it. Not vague spiritual advice, not philosophical consolation, practical, tested, neurologically coherent methods developed over 2.5 millennia of careful inner investigation. By the end of this video, you will understand your own anxious mind in a way that most people never get the chance to. And that understanding itself is the beginning of relief. Modern psychology defines anxiety as a future-oriented state of apprehension and perceived threat in the absence of an immediate, identifiable danger. That is a precise and useful definition, but Buddhism adds something that modern psychology has only recently begun to explore. Anxiety, in the Buddhist framework, is not primarily an emotion. It is a failure of attention. It is what happens when the mind, unable to rest in the present moment, projects itself into an imagined future and then reacts to that imaginary future as if it were happening right now. The suffering is completely real. The threat that is generating it in most cases is completely imaginary. The loop of overthinking works in a very specific and very consistent way once you know how to look at it. A thought arises about a problem, a person, a possible future event, a past mistake. Before the thought is even fully formed, the mind assigns it a feeling tone: unpleasant, threatening, destabilizing. And then, because the feeling tone is unpleasant, the mind tries to think its way out of it, which generates more thoughts, more unpleasant feeling tones, more thinking. This is the loop. Not a character flaw, not evidence of a broken mind, but a perfectly logical response to a misunderstanding about how thoughts and feelings actually work. Here is the misunderstanding at the center of the entire loop, the one the Buddha identified with startling clarity. The untrained mind treats every thought that arises as if it were a fact, as if thinking something makes it true or makes it imminent. You think something terrible is going to happen. The mind responds as if the terrible thing is already happening, flooding the body with stress hormones, narrowing attention, increasing vigilance. But the thought was never a fact. It was a mental event, arising, existing briefly, and if left alone, passing away. The entire practice of working with an anxious mind begins with that single recognition. A thought is a thought, not a reality. And here is something most approaches to overthinking miss almost entirely. The body is not a bystander in this process. When the mind enters the anxiety loop, the body responds immediately. Tension in the chest, shallowness of breath, tightness in the shoulders, a low hum of readiness for a threat that never arrives. And then, and this is crucial, the body's physical tension becomes its own signal to the mind that something is genuinely wrong. The mind and body create a feedback loop that can sustain anxiety almost indefinitely, with no external trigger whatsoever. Buddhism recognized this connection long before neuroscience gave it a name, and the practice it prescribes addresses both the mind and the body simultaneously. In the parts ahead, we are going to go through the Buddhist framework for understanding the anxious mind layer by layer. We will look at what Buddhism says thought actually is, and why treating thoughts as if they were facts is the central error. We will look at the anxiety-thought connection and what happens in the body when the loop runs. We will explore the specific Buddhist tools, meditation, mindfulness, the practice of non-reactivity, that have been shown to interrupt the loop reliably. And we will end with something the anxious mind rarely believes is possible, a way of moving through even the most difficult situations without being destroyed by the thinking about them. I want to say something directly before we go further, because this topic is not abstract and it is not comfortable. If you are someone who lives with chronic overthinking or anxiety, you know that being told to just relax or stop worrying is not only unhelpful, it is actively infuriating. This video is not going to tell you to relax, and it is not going to minimize what you experience. What it is going to do is hand you a map, not drawn by a stranger in a library, but drawn by people who sat with their own restless minds and found the way through. People who discovered, through patient practice, that the mind that cannot stop is not a life sentence. It is a mind that has not yet been introduced to itself. The Buddha himself was not born enlightened and serene, and the texts make this surprisingly clear for anyone willing to read carefully. Before his awakening, he struggled. He tried extreme asceticism that left him nearly dead. He wrestled with doubt, with the fear of failure, with the weight of the questions he could not yet answer. On the night of his enlightenment, the texts describe a sustained confrontation with Mara, the force of doubt, fear, and temptation that lasted hours. The Buddha did not achieve peace by having a mind that was already peaceful. He achieved it by developing a different relationship to a mind that was, at times, as stormy as anyone else's. That is not a small thing. That is the most important thing about the entire teaching on anxiety. The goal of the Buddhist path in relation to an anxious mind is not to make the mind stop thinking. It is not to achieve a state of permanent bliss in which no difficult thought ever arises again. It is to develop a fundamentally different relationship to thoughts, one in which they can arise, be clearly seen, and pass away without taking the entire being with them. That relationship is not built by wishing for it or intellectually agreeing it sounds nice. It is built steadily, patiently, unglamorously through consistent practice over time. This is part 2 because there is simply more to say, more depth to go to, more practical ground to cover. Part 1 laid the foundation. Part 2 is where we get into the room and look at every corner of it, where we stop describing the pond from the edge and actually get in the water, where the teaching stops being something you know about and becomes something you can begin to use today, this week, in the next difficult moment that arises. That is where this video is headed, and the only thing required of you is the willingness to stay with it. If you notice resistance arising as you listen, a part of you that wants to dismiss, debate, or distance itself from what is being said, notice that too. Yet resistance is not evidence that the teaching does not apply to you. It is often evidence that it applies more directly than is comfortable. The mind that overthinks is very good at protecting itself from the thing that would actually help it. It produces objections, counter-arguments, reasons why this particular approach could not possibly work for someone in your specific situation. That protective mechanism is worth watching, with curiosity rather than frustration, because watching it is already the beginning of the practice. By the end of this video, you will not have solved anxiety. Nobody solves anxiety in one sitting. Buddhism does not make that promise, and neither will we. What you will have is a framework clear enough and practical enough that you can actually begin using it in your real life, beginning today. You will understand why the loop runs, what keeps it running, and where its weakest points are. You will have at least one tool that works, not because it suppresses the anxious mind, but because it teaches the mind to see itself clearly. And that clear seeing, that honest, open, non-defensive looking at what the mind is actually doing, is where the relief begins. The overthinking loop is one of the most consistent experiences across every human culture and every period of history. The names and the content change, but the structure of the loop is nearly identical, regardless of who is running it. A thought arises. The thought is unpleasant. The mind tries to resolve the unpleasantness by thinking more, and the thinking generates more unpleasantness. Buddhism calls this papanka, the proliferation of thought. and it is described in the early texts with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable to read. Because the texts describe something that sounds less like ancient philosophy and more like a very accurate description of last Tuesday night. Chpater is sometimes translated as mental proliferation, sometimes as conceptual elaboration, and sometimes simply as the snowball. Because that is what it does. One thought rolls downhill and picks up more thoughts as it goes, growing heavier and faster with every turn. The original thought may have been small, a slight worry, a brief uncertainty, a moment of social discomfort. But by the time Chpater is done with it, the small original thought has become a catastrophe, a character assessment, a vision of a ruined future. All from a single passing thought that, if left alone and observed without engagement, would have dissolved in seconds. The Buddha identified 3 specific forces that feed the proliferation, that keep the snowball rolling instead of letting it melt. The first is sensory craving, the deep habitual pull toward pleasant experience and away from unpleasant experience. The second is views about existence, the rigid, fixed stories the mind tells about itself, others, and the world. The third is the underlying assumption of self, the belief that there is a permanent, solid me who needs to figure everything out and is in danger if it cannot. These 3 feed Chpater the way oxygen, fuel, and heat feed a fire. Remove any one of them, and the proliferation slows. Of the 3, the most important and the most subtle is the underlying assumption of self. Anxiety, at its core, is the threat perception of a self that believes it is separate, vulnerable, and ultimately alone in an unpredictable universe. Every anxious thought is, at its root, a story about what might happen to me, this particular, precious, fragile me that must be protected and preserved. Remove the absolute solidity of that me, not destroy it, but loosen its rigidity even slightly, and the grip of anxiety loosens with it. This is why the Buddhist teaching on non-self is not a metaphysical curiosity. It is a direct therapeutic tool for the anxious mind. Here is a simple but revealing observation about the nature of the anxious thought loop. In the loop, the mind is almost always in one of 2 places, the past or the future, rehearsing what was said, what happened, what went wrong, what it meant about you or about others, or anticipating what will happen, how bad it might be, whether you will be able to cope, what you should do to prevent disaster. Notice what is absent from that list. The present moment, because in the actual present moment, without exception, the catastrophe has not arrived. This is perhaps the most verifiable claim in the entire Buddhist teaching on anxiety, and you can verify it right now without any special training. Stop for 5 seconds and ask yourself, in this exact moment, in this actual present reality, is the thing I am worried about actually happening right now? Not in memory. Not in anticipation, right now in the space you occupy as you listen to this. For the vast majority of anxious thoughts in the vast majority of moments, the answer is no. The suffering is real. The cause of the suffering, the imagined catastrophe, is not present. That gap is where the practice lives. Buddhism does not say that real problems do not exist or that genuine dangers are not worth taking seriously. It is not a philosophy of pretending that difficulty is not real, that would be both naive and unkind. What it says is something far more precise. There is a difference between the actual problem and the thinking about the actual problem. The actual problem may be real and may deserve a clear, calm, intelligent response. But the loop is not a clear, calm, intelligent response. It is the mind attacking itself with its own worst imaginings, which generally makes the actual problem harder to address, not easier. There is a teaching from the Zen tradition that cuts right to the center of this distinction. A student went to the master and said, "Teacher, I have so many problems. My health, my work, my relationships, everything is difficult right now." The master said, "You have one problem. You think you have many problems." The student did not understand at first. Then slowly, over days of sitting with it, something became clear. The actual difficulties were separate events. The suffering came from the mind's insistence on holding all of them simultaneously and treating them as one overwhelming permanent reality. The loop also sustains itself through a mechanism that modern psychologists call cognitive fusion, the tendency to identify completely with one's thoughts. In cognitive fusion, there is no distance between the thinker and the thought. The thought is not something the mind is having. It is what the mind is. I am anxious becomes the thought anxiety is here visiting. I am a failure becomes the thought the mind is currently producing a story of failure. Buddhism has been teaching this distinction between awareness and the contents of awareness for 25 centuries without using the phrase cognitive fusion. It called it the difference between rigpa, pure awareness, and the thoughts that arise within it. The practical implication of this distinction is profound and immediately useful. If you are your thoughts, if anxiety is what you are, then there is nothing to do. You simply are anxious, the way a rock simply is a rock. But if awareness and thought are separate, if you are the space in which thoughts arise, exist briefly and pass away, then something becomes possible. The thought can be observed, noticed, seen for what it is, a mental event, not a fact, not a command, not a permanent resident. And what is seen clearly, what is known for what it is, cannot maintain the same grip over behavior and experience that it had when it was invisible. This is where the practice of mindfulness, specifically the formal sitting practice of meditation, becomes irreplaceable rather than optional. Mindfulness is not relaxation. It is not the absence of thought. It is not becoming calm in the sense of becoming blank. It is the trained capacity to observe the contents of the mind, including anxious thoughts, including the loop, without being automatically pulled into them. It is learning to stand at the edge of the pond and watch the stones fall into the water without throwing more stones yourself. The capacity is built through practice, boring, ordinary daily practice, and it builds slowly, reliably, and permanently when sustained. The common misconception about meditation that most beginners carry, and that prevents them from starting or sustaining a practice, is that the goal is to clear the mind of thoughts. When they sit down and thoughts immediately arise, which they always do without exception, they conclude that they are doing it wrong. They are not doing it wrong. The thoughts are not the failure. The thoughts are the material being worked with. Every time a thought arises and is noticed clearly without judgment, without getting swept away, and attention is gently returned to the object of meditation, that is a successful repetition. It is exactly like lifting a weight in a gym. The difficulty is the training. The resistance is what builds the capacity. Over time, weeks, months, years of consistent practice, something subtle and profound begins to happen. The gap between the arising of a thought and the automatic identification with it begins to widen. At first, the gap is almost invisible. The thought arises, and you are inside it before you even notice. Then gradually, occasional moments of noticing begin to appear. I'm thinking again. The loop has started. I can see it from here. That noticing, even when it comes long after the thought has already gripped, is the beginning of a freedom that compounds over time. Buddhism is also very specific about what sustains the loop beyond the initial thought, and it points at something called secondary suffering. The primary suffering is the thought, the worry, the loop itself. That is uncomfortable, but, in many cases, manageable. The secondary suffering is the suffering about the suffering, the judgment, the self-criticism, the frustration with the fact that you are anxious again. Why can I not just stop? What is wrong with me? Other people seem to be handling life fine. This must mean something terrible about who I am. That secondary layer, which most anxious people carry as heavily as the primary anxiety, is often more exhausting than the original concern. The Buddhist antidote to secondary suffering is something the tradition calls metta, loving kindness, applied specifically to oneself. Not self-indulgence, not permission to avoid the difficult work, a specific practiced quality of warm, patient, honest friendliness toward one's own experience. The instruction is simple enough to state and genuinely difficult to practice. Meet your own anxiety the way you would meet a frightened child who needs reassurance, not criticism. The anxious mind does not respond well to being scolded, judged, or told it is being unreasonable, any more than a frightened child would. It responds, eventually patiently with practice, to being met with steadiness, warmth, and the quiet confidence that what is here can be held. There is a reason the Buddha's prescription for the anxious, proliferating mind was not more thinking. He did not say, think more carefully. He did not say, think harder about your situation until you reach a conclusion that feels safe. He said, stop and watch, stop and breathe, stop and feel the ground beneath you and the air moving through you. Because the loop can only be broken from outside the loop, and the only place outside the loop is the present moment, accessed through the body and through direct sensory experience. This is why every Buddhist meditation tradition eventually comes back to the same instruction. Feel this breath in this body right now. The breath is not a spiritual symbol in the Buddhist tradition. It is a practical tool chosen for very specific reasons. It is always present. You cannot forget to bring it with you. It is always in the present moment. You cannot breathe in the past or the future, only right now. It is connected to the nervous system in ways that make it both a signal of inner states and a lever for changing them. And it requires no equipment, no special location, no particular set of beliefs to use effectively. When the body breathes consciously, when attention is genuinely placed on the physical sensation of breath moving in and out, something remarkable happens. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for calm, clear decision-making, becomes more active. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection and fear center, becomes less reactive. This is not spiritual metaphor. This has been measured in hundreds of peer-reviewed studies across the last 30 years. The Buddha did not have fMRI machines, but he had access to the same results through 25 centuries of careful inner observation. The loop cannot run at full power when genuine attention is on the breath, because genuine attention is a finite resource. You cannot simultaneously be fully present with the physical sensation of breathing and fully inside an imagined catastrophe at the same time. This is not suppression. You are not forcing the thought away. You are simply occupying the available attention with something real and immediate. The thought continues to arise, but it arises in the background of awareness rather than at its center. And from the background, thoughts have far less power. That shift in position, from center to background, is not small. It is the entire difference between being inside the loop and being able to see it. The loop of overthinking and anxiety is not your enemy, and treating it as an enemy is part of what keeps it strong. Buddhism asks something more interesting and more effective. Treat it as information, not as reality. Ask, what is this thought pointing at? What does this anxiety care about? What would be threatened if the worst thing I am imagining actually happened? The answers to those questions, arrived at from a place of calm curiosity rather than panicked problem-solving, often reveal something genuinely useful that the loop was trying to protect. And when the useful signal is received, the loop, which was never the enemy, often has less reason to keep running. One of the most liberating and most disorienting things the Buddha ever said about the mind is this: you are not your thoughts. Not as a consoling phrase, not as a motivational poster, as a precise, verifiable, directly observable fact about the nature of mental experience. Thoughts arise in the mind the way clouds arise in the sky. They appear, they change shape, they dissolve, they are replaced by other clouds. The sky does not become the clouds, and awareness, genuine, open, unconditioned awareness, does not become the thoughts that arise within it. This single distinction, when genuinely understood and directly experienced even once, changes the entire relationship to the overthinking mind permanently. In the Pali language and the language of the earliest Buddhist texts, the word for thought is vitakka. Vitakka means, roughly, the initial application of mind to an object, the moment the mind makes contact with something and begins to move toward it. Notice what is implicit in that definition. Thought is a movement, not a resident. It is a process, not a thing. It arrives at something, engages with it, and, if the process is allowed to complete naturally, moves away again. The problem the anxious mind has is not that vitakka arises. The problem is that it arrives, sets up furniture, and refuses to leave. Buddhism also distinguishes between two kinds of mental activity that the English word thinking collapses together. The first is purposeful, directed, problem-solving thought, the kind that is genuinely useful for navigating practical reality. The second is associative, reactive, emotionally driven mental proliferation, what the texts call the movement of the untrained mind that goes on without any useful destination. The overthinking loop belongs entirely to the second category. It feels like problem-solving. It presents itself as problem-solving, but it is running a completely different program. Learning to distinguish between these two, to recognize when genuine thinking has given way to compulsive mental activity, is one of the most practically valuable skills in all of Buddhist practice. The question that every serious student of Buddhism eventually asks about thought is this: where do thoughts come from? The conventional answer, I think them, turns out on careful examination to be much less clear than it initially seems. Sit quietly for 60 seconds and watch what thoughts arise. Notice that you did not choose those thoughts before they appeared. They simply arose, out of conditions, out of habit, out of the momentum of previous thoughts and experiences. If you were truly the author of your thoughts in the way the conventional story suggests, the anxious mind would be easy to stop. Simply stop choosing to think anxious thoughts. That it is not easy is itself evidence that the authorship story is not quite right. Buddhism has a clear and precise answer to the question of where thoughts come from. They arise from conditions, specifically from the combination of current sensory experience, memory, emotional state, and the deep grooves worn into the mind by habitual patterns of reaction over time. This is not fatalistic. It does not mean thoughts cannot change. It means they change in response to changing conditions. And the most powerful condition available to any human being for changing the quality of their thoughts is the deliberate cultivation of a different quality of awareness. That is what practice is, the systematic creation of the conditions in which clearer, calmer, less reactive thought naturally arises. There is a teaching in the early Buddhist texts, the Vitakkasanthana Sutta, specifically dedicated to working with unwanted thoughts. The Buddha gave 5 different methods for working with a persistent, troubling thought, listed in order from gentlest to most forceful. The first method is to replace the unwanted thought with a positive, helpful thought, turning attention from what is harmful to what is wholesome. The second is to examine the danger in continuing to entertain the thought, looking honestly at the cost of staying inside the loop. And the fifth, the most forceful, reserved for extreme cases, is to clench the teeth and press the tongue to the roof of the mouth and, through sheer force of will, refuse to let the thought run. The full sequence exists because different minds, in different states, need different approaches. The first method, replacing an unwanted thought with a wholesome one, is often misunderstood as simple distraction. It is not distraction. It is more precisely described as redirection, moving deliberate attention towards something that genuinely nourishes rather than depletes. The difference between distraction and redirection is the quality of attention involved. Distraction runs away, redirection moves toward. When the anxious mind is absorbed in the worst-case scenario, the practice is to deliberately, actively, not passively, move attention towards something that is actually true, actually present, and actually good. Not pretending the difficulty does not exist, refusing to give it more of your finite attention than it actually deserves. The second method, examining the danger in continuing, is what modern cognitive therapy would recognize as looking at the evidence for and against a catastrophic belief. But Buddhism frames it differently, and the framing matters. Not is this thought true or false, but is this thought useful or harmful to entertain right now? If rehearsing this worry for the next hour will genuinely produce a useful solution, then it deserves the attention. If rehearsing it for the next hour will produce more anxiety, more exhaustion, and no practical insight, then the honest answer to the question of usefulness is clear. And that honest answer, made not in self-criticism but in the same clear-eyed way you would assess whether to keep holding something heavy, is already a small act of liberation. The third method, not giving the thought the attention it demands, is perhaps the most counterintuitive and the most misunderstood. The mind's natural response to an unwanted thought is to engage with it, to argue with it, analyze it, try to disprove it, or find a way to make it go away. But engaging with a thought, any thought, even hostile, even negative, feeds it. Attention is the food that thoughts grow on. The instruction here is not to fight the thought and not to surrender to it, but to simply not attend to it with the energy of engagement, to let it be there the way background traffic noise is there, present, audible, but not commanding the center of attention. The fourth method, looking at the root of the thought, is in some ways the most sophisticated and the most genuinely therapeutic. Instead of fighting the thought or redirecting from it, the instruction is to trace it back. What is this thought actually about? Not the surface content, not the specific worry about the specific situation, but the deeper need, the deeper fear, the deeper assumption about self and world that generates this kind of thought reliably. This is inner archaeology, patient, careful, non-judgmental excavation of what is actually driving the mental activity. And what is found at the bottom in the Buddhist framework is almost always some version of the same three things: ignorance, craving, or aversion. And the good news is that all three can be worked with. The fifth method, the forceful suppression, is the last resort, reserved for thoughts so destructive that the other approaches are not gaining traction. The Buddha was clear that this method should not be the first choice because it does not address the root. It simply overpowers the symptom. A thought suppressed by force tends to resurface, often at a less convenient time and with more intensity than before. But in a crisis, when the thought is overwhelming and the more subtle approaches are not accessible, the capacity to firmly say no and redirect attention by force is a genuinely useful skill. The key is to develop the other four methods so thoroughly that the fifth is rarely needed, and when it is needed, to use it without guilt. Across all five methods, one principle runs consistently through the entire Vitakkasanthana Sutta. The practitioner remains active. This is not a passive letting go. This is not waiting for thoughts to somehow resolve themselves on their own. It is deliberate, skilled, practiced engagement with the activity of the mind, not fighting it, not suppressing it, but working with it intelligently. The mind that has trained in these methods develops what the texts call sampajana, clear comprehension, the ongoing background awareness of what the mind is doing at any given moment. And clear comprehension is the single most practical cognitive skill a human being can develop for managing the experience of an anxious, overactive, proliferating mind. There is a beautiful image used in the Zen tradition to describe what a well-trained relationship to thought looks like. The master describes the mind of a novice meditator as a whiteboard on which thoughts write themselves in permanent marker, each one permanent, each one demanding attention. The mind of the experienced practitioner is the same whiteboard, but the marker has become dry erase. Thoughts still write themselves. They are still visible, still legible, but they do not stick. They can be noted and wiped away without leaving a mark. The thoughts are not different. The surface they are written on is different, and the surface is changed by practice. This distinction between the thought and the one who sees the thought, between the contents of the mind and the awareness that observes them, is sometimes called the witness position in contemplative traditions. It is not a place of cold detachment or emotional unavailability. It is a place of genuine, warm, clear seeing. From the witness position, difficulty is still difficult. Pain is still painful. Anxiety is still uncomfortable. But it is held differently, with more space around it, with less desperate urgency to make it stop, with a kind of patient curiosity that the loop mind cannot access. And from that held place, the possibility of a genuinely useful response, rather than a reactive, fear-driven one, becomes real. One of the most consistently reported experiences of people who develop a sustained meditation practice is this: thoughts become slower. Not quieter necessarily, and not fewer, but slower, with more space between them. And in that space, however brief, a recognition becomes possible that was not possible when the thoughts were running at their usual speed. The recognition that there is awareness here, that there is a quality of presence that was there before the thought arose and is here after it passes. That presence is not created by meditation. It is uncovered by it. The way the sun is not created by clouds dispersing, but simply becomes visible when they do. The Buddhist teaching on thought ultimately leads to the same place as the teaching on self, to the recognition that what we take to be a solid, continuous, authored stream of thought is actually something quite different up close. Up close, the stream is a sequence of discrete mental events, each arising from conditions, each brief, each passing when its conditions fall away. The continuity is created by memory and narrative, the story the mind tells itself about its own continuity. And when that narrative is examined carefully, in meditation, in clear-eyed, honest reflection, it becomes transparent in a way that is simultaneously disorienting and deeply, permanently relieving. Because what is transparent cannot grip the same way. What is seen clearly cannot frighten the same way. What is known for what it is has lost the power it had when it was mistaken for something else. There is a story from the Theravada tradition about a monk who came to his teacher deeply troubled by violent and disturbing thoughts that arose in meditation. He was ashamed of the thoughts and afraid they indicated something fundamentally wrong with his character or his practice. The teacher said, "Show me these thoughts, bring them here and show them to me." The monk said, "I cannot, they have passed." And the teacher replied, "Then where is the problem? The thought that is gone is not the problem. The thought that is here can be seen. The only thought that maintains its power is the one you neither examine nor release, the one you hold at arm's length in the dark." This is perhaps the most counterintuitive instruction in the Buddhist toolkit for the anxious mind. Move toward the thought, not away from it. Not to engage with its content, not to argue with it or analyze it or try to solve the problem it is presenting, but to turn genuine, clear, steady attention toward the thought itself, to look at it rather than from inside it. Where do I feel this thought in the body? What is its quality, its texture, its weight, its urgency? What happens to it when it is held in clear, patient, non-reactive awareness rather than either fought or followed? What happens, in most cases, is exactly what the Buddha described in the first moment of genuine insight. The thought, held in clear awareness without either grasping or aversion, the same mindful non-reactivity that we discussed in the context of feeling tones, begins to lose its intensity. Not always immediately, not always completely, but the trajectory consistently observed across thousands of practitioners across centuries is unmistakable. What is clearly seen has less power than what is not clearly seen. What is known for what it is has less grip than what is mistaken for something else. The light of awareness is the most consistently effective tool for reducing the power of the thought loop, not because it destroys the thoughts, but because it shows them for what they actually are. What thoughts actually are, seen clearly without the projection of solidity and permanence, is this: brief, conditioned, impersonal mental events arising from causes, existing momentarily, passing away. Not facts, not commands, not evidence about the nature of reality or the nature of you. Just events in consciousness, like sounds heard during meditation, arising, existing briefly, and passing. The sky of awareness is not changed by the clouds that move through it. Neither is your deepest nature changed by the thoughts, however stormy, that arise within it. Knowing this clearly, from direct experience, rather than just from hearing someone say it, is a genuine and permanent form of freedom. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Buddhist practitioners discovered through direct experience 25 centuries ago. The mind and the body are not separate systems. They are one continuous, mutually influencing, constantly communicating system, and you cannot work effectively with an anxious mind while ignoring the body it lives in. The brain sends signals to the body, but the body also sends signals back to the brain, continuously in real time. This bidirectional communication means that changing the state of the body changes the state of the mind. And this is not a peripheral insight in Buddhist practice, it is central to it. The instruction to return to the breath is not a breathing exercise. It is an intervention in the nervous system using the most direct access point available. When the anxiety loop is running, the body moves into a state called sympathetic nervous system activation, or, in common language, fight or flight mode. The heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow and rapid, muscles tighten, particularly in the shoulders, jaw, chest, and stomach. The digestive system slows. The immune system becomes temporarily suppressed. Blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the calm, clear-thinking part of the brain, toward the more reactive limbic system. This physical response evolved to help human beings survive genuine physical threats, a predator, a fall, an attack. But in the context of modern anxious thinking, the system is activated not by a real threat, but by an imagined one. And it runs at a cost, continuously, without producing any physical survival benefit at all. The Buddhist body scan practice, called Kaya contemplation, one of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, addresses this directly. The instruction is to move attention systematically through the body, not to relax it by force, but to actually feel what is there. The tension in the jaw that has been there so long you stopped noticing it. The held quality of the breath that is too short, too high, never fully completing itself. The contracted feeling in the chest that you have been interpreting as a fact about your situation, rather than a sensation in your body. Feeling these sensations directly without judgment, without immediately trying to make them go away, begins to change their relationship to the mind. What the body scan reveals, almost universally for people who practice it, is that physical tension is not a response to danger. It is, at this point, a deeply ingrained habit, a default holding pattern that the body has maintained for so long that it no longer feels like a choice. Most chronically anxious people have been carrying significant physical tension for years, in the shoulders, the belly, the face, that they have completely stopped noticing because it became the baseline. The body scan brings attention to what is actually present, not to judge it, not to fix it with effort, but to simply know it. And what is known clearly, what is seen rather than unconsciously carried, begins naturally and without forcing to release. There is a teaching in the Theravada tradition specifically about the relationship between the body and the quality of mind. The Buddha said, "Monks, if the body is well trained, the mind is well trained. If the body is settled, the mind is settled." This is not about physical exercise, though exercise has genuine benefits for mental health that Buddhism has always recognized. It is about the quality of inhabitation, whether a person is genuinely present in their own body or is living almost entirely in the conceptual world of thought, memory, and anticipation. Most anxious people are, functionally, disembodied, living from the neck up in a world of concepts, almost entirely disconnected from the physical sensations of the present moment. The practice of mindful walking Kinhin in Zen, Kankama in the Pali tradition, is one of the oldest and most effective tools for re-establishing this connection. The instruction is simple: walk slowly and feel each step, the lifting of the foot, the movement through space, the placing back down, the weight shifting. Not as a performance, not as a technique, as a genuine act of returning attention to the physical reality of being alive in a body moving through space. Most people who try this find it extraordinarily difficult for the first few minutes. The mind immediately generates reasons to stop, things to think about, objections to the pace. That difficulty is not a reason to stop. It is precisely the training that is needed, the repeated practice of bringing the persistently abstract mind back into contact with the concrete and the immediate. The breath is always available and always present, but the Buddhist tradition also points to specific breath practices that are particularly useful for the anxious mind. One of the most widely used is called counting the breath, simply counting each exhale from 1 to 10, and when the mind wanders, beginning again at 1. The purpose of the counting is not to achieve a counted breath. The purpose is to have an immediate, objective way of knowing when the mind has wandered and a simple way of returning. Most people discover when they try this that they rarely get past 4 or 5 before the mind has been swept into thought. And this discovery is humbling and useful in equal measure. Humbling because it shows how little control the mind actually has over itself. Useful because it makes the degree of training genuinely visible, and what is visible can be worked with. The exhale deserves special attention in the context of anxiety, because the exhale is the body's natural activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. When you breathe out fully, not just partially but genuinely completely, allowing the belly to release and the breath to travel all the way out, the nervous system receives a direct signal that the threat is over. This is why a deep sigh is the body's natural self-calming mechanism. It is an elongated exhale, occurring spontaneously when the nervous system has been under pressure. The practice of deliberately lengthening the exhale, breathing in for 4 counts and out for 6, or in for 4 and out for 8, is not a relaxation trick. It is a direct intervention in the autonomic nervous system. And it works the same way for everyone who has a nervous system, regardless of whether they believe in Buddhism, meditation, or anything else. Buddhism also points to the importance of posture, not as a ritual requirement, but as a practical influence on the quality of mind. The classic meditation posture, spine upright, shoulders released, chest open, hands resting without clutching, is designed to support a quality of alert, open awareness. The collapsed posture of someone who is depressed, or the tense, hunched posture of someone who is anxious, both create physical conditions that reinforce the mental states they accompany. Changing the posture, deliberately, not as performance, creates different physical conditions, which influence the nervous system, which influences the quality of mind. Sit up, open the chest, breathe. These instructions are not incidental to the practice, they are the practice understood in its full physical dimension. One of the most commonly overlooked body-based interventions for anxiety is the deliberate engagement of the 5 senses with the present moment. Name 5 things you can see right now. Notice 4 things you can feel. Hear 3 distinct sounds. Smell 2 things. Taste 1. This practice, simple enough to seem trivial, effective enough to have been rediscovered independently by multiple therapeutic traditions, works because the senses exist only in the present moment. You cannot smell last Tuesday, you cannot hear tomorrow. The senses are anchored in the now, and deliberately engaging them brings the mind, however briefly and reluctantly, back from the future and the past. Buddhism calls this the return to bare attention, the direct, unmediated experience of what is actually present in this moment through the actual sense organs. And it is described as the most direct route back to the peace that the overthinking mind has been searching for in completely the wrong places. The gut, what modern gastroenterology calls the enteric nervous system, has been called the second brain. It contains approximately 100 million neurons, more than the spinal cord, and communicates directly with the brain through the vagus nerve, sending more signals upward than it receives. When the gut is contracted with anxiety, those signals tell the brain that something is wrong, which increases anxiety, which contracts the gut further. Buddhist traditions across multiple cultures have long associated the belly, the hara in Japanese practice, the lower dantian in Chinese traditions, with the seat of stable, grounded awareness. The instruction to breathe into the belly, to allow the breath to fill the lower abdomen fully rather than remaining trapped in the chest, is both a physiological intervention and a return to a quality of being that the body already knows. Sleep deprivation and anxiety create a relationship that is almost perfectly circular and perfectly cruel. Anxiety makes it difficult to sleep. Sleep deprivation makes the anxious mind dramatically more reactive and less able to work with difficult thoughts skillfully. The less you sleep, the more anxious the mind becomes. The more anxious the mind becomes, the less able it is to sleep. Buddhism, which has always treated the body as a vehicle requiring genuine care and maintenance, addresses this directly through the concept of right effort in sleep, not pushing the body past its genuine capacity, not ignoring the signals it sends, treating rest as a practice rather than a reward. The monk's schedule in a traditional Buddhist monastery is built around this understanding, rigorous practice, and genuine rest, in balance, because the exhausted mind cannot practice clearly any more than a flat tire can drive. There is a practice in the Tibetan tradition called nidra, awareness during sleep, that treats the transition into sleep as a meditation opportunity rather than a problem to be solved. The instruction is to let the body settle completely, release all effort, and allow awareness to remain present as sleep approaches. Most people who try this report that they fall asleep before they would typically expect, because the effort of trying to sleep is itself a significant contributor to insomnia. The irony that the instruction to stop trying is the thing that produces the desired result is one that the Buddhist tradition does not find ironic at all. It finds it perfectly consistent. Trying harder is rarely the answer. Letting the effort go, with skill, with practice, with genuine release, is almost always where the result has been waiting. One of the most powerful body-based practices available to the anxious mind is what Buddhism calls the contemplation of the four elements within the body. Earth, the solid, heavy quality felt in the bones and muscles and the sense of weight and stability. Water, the fluid, moving quality of blood, breath moisture, and the constant internal circulation. Fire, the warmth of the body, the heat of digestion and metabolism, the temperature that sustains life. Air, the movement of breath, the subtle vibration of the body, the sense of expansion and contraction that accompanies each inhale and exhale. This contemplation serves a specific and subtle purpose. It dissolves the sense of the body as a solid, fixed, unitary thing, and reveals it as a dynamic, flowing process. The same insight that the teaching on non-self applies to the mind, the self is a process, not a thing. The four elements contemplation applies to the body, and when the body is experienced as a flowing process rather than a solid object, the holding patterns that anxiety creates in it become much easier to release. You cannot fully clench a river, and when the body is felt as more river than stone, the clenching that anxiety demands becomes genuinely harder to maintain. This is not merely metaphorical. It is a direct change in the body's experience quality, produced by a shift in the quality of attention brought to it. Modern trauma therapy, particularly somatic approaches like somatic experiencing and EMDR, has rediscovered much of what Buddhist body practices have been teaching for millennia. The insight that trauma and chronic anxiety are stored not primarily in memory, but in the body, in held patterns of tension, in the nervous system's stuck alarm response, is central to modern somatic therapy. And the prescription, Move attention into the body, feel what is there, allow the held patterns to become visible and then to release, is remarkably close to what the Buddhist body scan and kaya contemplation prescribe. The convergence is not coincidental. Both traditions are looking carefully at the same reality, the human body under the influence of unprocessed fear, and arriving at similar conclusions, which is in itself a form of evidence that deserves attention. The relationship between the body and the quality of mind is perhaps most dramatically visible in the practice of walking meditation done with full, genuine attention. When someone genuinely arrives in the body during walking meditation, feeling each footfall, each shift of weight, each movement of the legs through the air, something visible changes. The facial muscles soften, the breath deepens, the shoulders drop. The pace naturally slows to something that matches the actual speed at which the body moves most comfortably. And the quality of mind, though the world outside has not changed at all, shifts from the tight, urgent, planning quality of anxious thought to something more open, more present, more genuinely alive. That shift is the body's natural state. Not the tension, not the urgency, not the constant readiness for a threat that never arrives. The natural state is available. It is just covered over by habit. The anxious mind tends to treat the body as a problem, as a source of symptoms, a container for discomfort, something that needs to be managed or overridden. Buddhism asks for a complete reversal of that relationship. The body is the sanctuary, not the source of the problem. The problem lives in the abstracted, story-making, future-projecting mind. The body exists only here, only now, only in this breath, this heartbeat, this felt sense of aliveness. The instruction to come home to the body, to return to it again and again as the base of practice, is the instruction to come home to the only place where peace is actually available. Not the peace of a mind that has solved all its problems, the peace that was here before the problems were conceived and will be here when the last thought has finally settled. One practice worth mentioning specifically for the anxious mind is called metta, or loving kindness meditation. Not in its general form, but directed specifically at the body. The instruction is to move attention through the body systematically, and at each location, feet, legs, belly, chest, arms, face, to offer a quiet, genuine wish for ease. May this body be at ease. May these shoulders soften. May this breath be free. This is not positive thinking. It is not pretending the tension is not there. It is meeting the physical reality of anxiety with a quality of warm, patient attention that the body rarely receives. And the body, which has been waiting for that quality of attention, responds. The ultimate teaching of Buddhism on the body and anxiety is this: the body is not the obstacle to peace. It is the doorway to it. Everything that the mind needs to find genuine rest is available through the body in this present moment. The breath, the weight, the warmth, the simple fact of being alive right now. The anxious mind has been looking for peace in the one place it cannot be found. In the future, in the solved version of the problem, in the arrival of the circumstances it keeps imagining. The body knows where peace is. It has always known. The practice is simply the art of listening to what the body already knows, instead of drowning it out with the noise of an untrained mind. Begin with one breath, one full, conscious, deliberate breath, feeling it arrive, feeling it fill, feeling it leave. That is where it starts. That is where everything changes. Rumination is the name modern psychology gives to the specific kind of overthinking that circles back obsessively to past events. Replaying them, reanalyzing them, trying to extract a meaning that makes the discomfort settle. Buddhism does not use the word rumination, but it describes the same phenomenon with a precision that clinical psychology is still catching up to. The Pali word is anusaya, usually translated as latent tendencies or underlying dispositions, the deep grooves in the mind that determine which direction attention flows when it is not deliberately directed. And Nusaya explains why the anxious mind returns to the same material again and again. It is following its deepest grooves, traveling its most worn paths. And what carved those grooves is not the conscious mind, but the accumulated weight of habitual, emotional reaction, sustained across years, sometimes decades, sometimes, in the Buddhist view, across lifetimes. Emotions in the Buddhist framework are not problems to be solved or enemies to be overcome. They are information, arising from conditions, communicating something about the relationship between the self-sense and the current experience. Fear communicates, something here feels threatening to my survival or my sense of self. Grief communicates, something valued has been lost, and the loss needs to be felt fully before integration can happen. Anger communicates, something I believe is important has been disrespected, damaged, or threatened. And this information, when received clearly rather than acted on blindly, is often genuinely useful. The problem is not that emotions arise. The problem is what the untrained mind does with them. The untrained mind has essentially two responses to difficult emotions: suppression or amplification. Suppression. The emotion is pushed down, covered over, not looked at, stored in the body as held tension, expressed indirectly, and available to surge at the worst possible times. Amplification. The emotion is grabbed, analyzed, dramatized, told a story, given a permanent resident status in the mind, which makes it bigger and more persistent than its natural lifespan would allow. The Buddhist middle path runs between these two. Feel the emotion fully, without the story, without the amplification, and without the suppression, and allow it to complete its natural course. The natural lifespan of an emotion, stripped of the story and the mental amplification, is genuinely short. Research in neuroscience suggests that a pure emotional response without any cognitive feeding lasts approximately 60 to 90 seconds in the body. 90 seconds. After that, what remains is not the original emotion, but the sustained thinking about the emotion, the rumination, the story, the secondary suffering. Buddhism arrived at this observation without neuroscience, through the simple practice of watching emotions carefully and noting what they actually do when left alone. They arise, they peak, they subside, exactly like every other conditioned phenomenon, because they are exactly like every other conditioned phenomenon. This is why one of the most powerful instructions in Buddhist practice is also one of the most counterintuitive for the anxious mind. Stop adding to the emotion. Not suppress it, not force it away. Stop feeding it with the story of what it means, where it came from, and how long it will last. Just feel it, in the body, as sensation, without the narrative scaffolding that the mind automatically erects around every emotional experience. The tight feeling in the chest, the weight in the stomach, the heat in the face. These are the actual emotion. The rest is interpretation. And interpretation, however understandable, is what feeds the rumination and extends the suffering far beyond the natural 90 seconds. This practice, sometimes called bare attention to emotion, is described in the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundational text on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The instruction for working with mental objects, including emotions, is to know the arising, the presence, and the passing of each mental state as it occurs. Not analyze it, not explain it, not fix it or improve it or make it into something different from what it is. Know it clearly, directly, without the addition of any story that the mind wants to tell about it. This quality of knowing, steady, patient, interested, non-reactive, is perhaps the single most therapeutic stance any human mind can take toward its own emotional life. Regret is one of the most common forms of ruminative suffering, and Buddhism addresses it with unusual clarity and unusual directness. The Buddha distinguished clearly between 2 responses to having acted badly or made a mistake. The first response is called shame, a global attack on the self, an equation of the action with the permanent identity. I did a bad thing, therefore I am fundamentally bad. The The second response is called remorse, a clear, focused, non-self-attacking recognition of the harm caused, accompanied by a genuine intention to do differently going forward. Remorse is healthy, useful, and leads to growth. Shame is a loop that leads nowhere and serves no one, not the person suffering it and not anyone who was harmed. This distinction between the specific action and the global self runs through every Buddhist teaching on working with negative emotion. The action can be evaluated, understood, and responded to wisely. The self, the entire complex evolving multidimensional person who performed the action, cannot be reduced to any single act. This is not a permission to avoid accountability. It is actually the opposite. Accountability becomes possible when the self is not under total attack. The person in shame cannot learn from their mistake, because all available cognitive resources are occupied with defending or punishing the self. The person in genuine remorse is free to look clearly at what happened and why, and that clear looking is where genuine change begins. Worry, the specific form of anxiety that focuses on the future, deserves its own understanding in the Buddhist framework. The Buddha acknowledged that thinking about the future is sometimes genuinely necessary, planning, preparing, taking reasonable precautions. What he pointed at as the source of suffering is not future thinking in itself. It is the quality of fear that accompanies the future thinking and makes it circular rather than productive. There is a simple test available for distinguishing useful future thinking from worry. After thinking about this for 5 minutes, do I have a clearer plan or more useful information than I had before? If yes, the thinking was useful. If no, if the thinking has simply generated more anxiety without any practical output, that is the loop, and the invitation is to step out of it. The Buddhist understanding of equanimity, upekkha in Pali, is perhaps the most misunderstood teaching in relation to emotion. Equanimity is often heard as indifference, as not caring, as remaining unmoved by anything. But in the Buddhist texts, equanimity is not indifference. It is the quality of a mind that can feel everything fully while remaining stable, that can be moved without being swept away. Think of the difference between a ship anchored in a storm and a ship with no anchor in the same storm. Both are in the storm. Both are moved by the waves. But one is moved from a place of stability, and that stability is upekkha, the equanimous quality of mind that practice builds. The emotional tone of the Buddha's own teaching, often lost in academic discussions of Buddhist philosophy, is one of extraordinary warmth. He consistently described the awakened mind not as cold or detached, but as radiating metta, loving kindness, in all directions, without conditions. Loving kindness is not a sentimental feeling. It is a quality of genuine well-wishing for oneself, for others, for all beings, that is available even in the presence of difficulty, even toward people and situations that are genuinely challenging. The practice of metta meditation is the systematic cultivation of this quality, beginning with oneself, extending to loved ones, to neutral people, to difficult people, and eventually to all beings without exception. For the anxious, ruminative mind, which tends to be hard on itself and hard on others, this practice is not optional. It is the specific antidote to the specific poison that sustains the loop. There is a teaching in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition called Tonglen, which translates roughly as sending and taking, that addresses the relationship between personal suffering and universal compassion. The practice runs counter to every instinct. Instead of breathing in fresh air and breathing out the difficulty, Tonglen instructs the practitioner to breathe in the suffering, their own and others, and breathe out relief. The logic is deliberate and profound. By willingly taking in suffering rather than trying to escape it, the mind's relationship to discomfort is fundamentally transformed. The suffering that was an enemy to be fled becomes material to work with, and in working with it for others as well as oneself, the grip of personal anxiety is loosened by the widening of the frame of reference. This is not masochism. It is the discovery that the heart is more spacious than anxiety tells you it is, and that spaciousness is the actual antidote to the claustrophobia of the loop. The middle path between suppression and amplification, between running from emotion and drowning in it, has a specific, practical quality that is worth naming clearly. It is the quality of sitting with something difficult the way you might sit with a sick friend, not fixing it, not leaving, not making it worse by your agitation, just being present with what is there, present enough to feel it fully, stable enough not to be destroyed by it. This quality of presence, steady, warm, patient, interested, is not a natural talent for most people, and it is certainly not a natural talent for the anxious mind. It is a trained capacity, and it is trained through exactly the kind of practice we have been describing, consistently, humbly, and without the expectation of immediate results. One of the most consistent findings in contemplative research is that experienced meditators show dramatically different brain responses to negative emotional stimuli than non-meditators. Non-meditators show prolonged activation in the amygdala, the threat detection center, when exposed to negative images or stressful scenarios. Experienced practitioners show an initial spike in the same region, they feel it fully, followed by a much faster return to baseline. They are not feeling less. They are recovering faster. They are not numbing themselves to difficult experience. They are processing it more efficiently and releasing it more completely. That capacity to feel fully and recover quickly, without the prolonged rumination that keeps the difficult experience alive long after it has ended, is perhaps the most clinically significant benefit of sustained Buddhist practice. Anger deserves specific attention in the context of the anxious overthinking mind, because anxiety and anger are more closely related than most people realize. Anxiety is often the first layer of a response, whose second layer is anger, because anger is easier to feel than the vulnerability beneath it. Buddhism treats anger with unusual seriousness, not because it is uniquely sinful, but because it is uniquely destructive to the quality of mind required for practice. The texts compare anger to a piece of hot coal held in the hand. Whatever it is thrown at, the one holding it is burned first. The instruction for working with anger is not to suppress it. Suppressed anger is a wound that does not heal, but to trace it, patiently and honestly, back to the vulnerability it is protecting. Anxiety can also be understood in the Buddhist framework as a kind of mistaken love, a fierce, exhausting attachment to outcomes for people and situations we care about deeply. The parent who cannot sleep because they are worried about their child is not experiencing a malfunction. They are experiencing the suffering side of love without the wisdom side. The wisdom side of love, which Buddhism cultivates through practice, includes the recognition that outcomes cannot ultimately be controlled by the quality of worry brought to bear on them. The child's safety is not improved by the parent's sleepless night of catastrophic imagination, but the parent's health, and therefore their capacity to genuinely support the child, is significantly damaged by it. Wisdom does not eliminate caring. It channels caring into what is actually useful, and redirects what is not useful back toward the peace that makes genuine care possible. The path through difficult emotion in the Buddhist view is never around it, and never through force. It is directly through, with clear eyes, a stable posture, a deliberate breath, and the quiet confidence that what arises in consciousness can be held in awareness without destroying the one who holds it. This confidence is not bravado. It is the accumulated evidence of every moment of honest practice, every time the difficult feeling was sat with and the world did not end. Each of those moments, however small, however private, however unglamorous, builds the capacity for the next one. And the capacity, built patiently and honestly over time, eventually reaches a point where the most difficult emotion is not a threat, but simply what is here. And what is simply here can always be met. There is a moment in practice, described by meditators across traditions and across centuries, when the relationship to difficult emotions suddenly and completely reverses. Instead of being the person who is afraid of what the emotion will do, the practitioner becomes the space in which the emotion arises. Instead of being defined by the anxiety, the practitioner experiences the anxiety as one event in an awareness that is much larger than the event. This moment is not an achievement to be reached through effort. It is a recognition that is always available and is simply uncovered when the right conditions are present. And the right conditions, steady practice, genuine self-honesty, the willingness to feel fully without the story, are exactly what every part of this video has been pointing toward. The relationship between emotion and liberation in Buddhism is subtle and frequently misunderstood. Liberation is not the absence of emotion. The Buddha felt grief, expressed joy, experienced the full range of human feeling throughout his 45 years of teaching. Liberation is the end of being unconsciously driven by emotion, of being swept by the current of feeling without any awareness that a current is running. The awakened mind still feels, but it feels from a ground of awareness that is not altered or overwhelmed by what it feels. The current still runs, but the swimmer knows how to swim, and for a swimmer, a current is not a catastrophe, it is simply the river. The invitation of this entire section is simple and specific. The next time a difficult emotion arises, whether anxiety, anger, grief, or the particular exhaustion of the person who has been overthinking for too long, try something different. Instead of immediately trying to make it stop, or immediately drowning in it and following it wherever it wants to go, pause. Feel it in the body. Notice where it lives, what its texture is, how it changes as attention is brought to it. Breathe, genuinely, deliberately, all the way to the bottom of the exhale and back. And hold what is there with the same quality of steady, patient, non-judgmental presence that you would offer to someone you genuinely love who is suffering. Because the person who is suffering is you. Every genuine spiritual tradition ultimately has to answer one practical question. What do you actually do? Not the philosophy, not the cosmology, not the explanation of why things are the way they are, but the practice. What do you do when you sit down in the morning and the mind is already running? What do you do when you are in the middle of a conversation and the anxiety loop begins? What do you do at 3 in the morning when the thoughts will not stop, and the silence in the room has the quality of a held breath? Buddhism has specific, tested, practical answers to all of these questions, and the next section is where they live. The most foundational practice for the anxious mind, the one the Buddha taught first and returned to most consistently, is anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. The instruction is given in the Anapanasati Sutta, and it is both precise and remarkably accessible. Breathe in, knowing you are breathing in. Breathe out, knowing you are breathing out. This is not complicated. It is also not easy, because knowing, in the sense the Buddha means it, is not a casual acknowledgement, but a genuine, full, present moment contact with the actual physical sensation of breathing. Not thinking about the breath, not visualizing the breath, actually feeling the breath as a physical, immediate, real-time event occurring in the body right now. The difference between thinking about the breath and actually feeling the breath is the difference between reading a menu and eating the food. Anapanasati is traditionally taught in 16 steps, moving progressively from basic awareness of breath to awareness of the entire body, to working with mental formations, to direct insight into impermanence. For the anxious mind beginning the practice, the first 4 steps are entirely sufficient and genuinely transformative when practiced consistently. Step 1. Know the length of the breaths. Is it long or short? Just notice, no preference, no judgment. Step 2. Know the whole body. Feel the breath not just in the nostrils or the chest, but as a movement that involves the entire body with every cycle. Step 3 and 4. Move into the relationship between breath and the feeling tone that accompanies it. the beginning of the precise intervention at the feeling tone to craving link that we discussed in the context of dependent origination. The instruction to set aside a specific time for formal sitting practice is not a religious requirement. It is a practical necessity. The mind that tries to practice mindfulness only in the middle of stressful situations is like a person who tries to learn to swim only when drowning. Formal sitting practice, even 10 minutes a day, even 5, builds the capacity and the familiarity with the practice that makes it available in difficult moments. Think of it as training rather than therapy. Therapy is what you reach for when the crisis has arrived. Training is what you do so that the crisis is met differently when it comes. The anxious mind consistently resists the idea of sitting down and deliberately doing nothing, and that resistance is precisely why the sitting practice is particularly valuable for the anxious mind. The sitting posture matters, not as ritual but as support for the quality of attention. The spine should be upright enough to support wakefulness, relaxed enough not to create tension, stable enough to allow sustained attention without distraction from physical discomfort. A chair is entirely acceptable for most Western practitioners. The goal is a posture that can be maintained comfortably for the intended duration of the site. The eyes can be gently closed or slightly open with a downward gaze. Both are traditional, both are effective. Hands can rest in the lap or on the knees. The specific position matters less than the quality of ease in the arms and shoulders. When the formal sitting practice is established, walking meditation becomes a natural and powerful complement. The anxious mind generates a particular kind of physical restlessness, the need to move, to do something, to externalize the inner agitation. Walking meditation works with this restlessness rather than against it. Channel the movement into a deliberate, conscious, mindful activity. The instruction is to walk more slowly than normal, half speed or slower, and to bring genuine attention to each component of each step. The heel lifting from the ground, the leg moving forward through the air, the foot settling back down, the weight transferring. Begin again. Journaling, while not a specifically Buddhist practice, has been adopted by many Buddhist teachers as a valuable tool for the anxious and ruminative mind. The instruction is specific. Write down the thought or worry that is running clearly and honestly without editing or softening. Then write down what you actually know to be true about the situation, not what you fear, not what might happen, but what is currently verifiably true. Then write down what, if anything, you can actually do about this situation right now or in the near future. And finally, what would it feel like to genuinely release what you cannot control, not as a rhetorical question, as a real felt sense in the body? Metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, deserves its own careful treatment as a practical tool for the anxious mind. The traditional sequence begins with directing loving kindness toward oneself, which for many anxious people turns out to be the hardest phase of the entire practice. The instruction is to bring to mind a simple, sincere wish for one's own well-being. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, may I live with ease. Not as a positive affirmation spoken without genuine feeling, as a real heartfelt wish, the same quality of warmth that most people can access when genuinely wishing a loved one well, turned toward oneself. For people who have spent years treating themselves with harsh internal criticism, which describes most chronically anxious people, this practice is not just comforting, it is genuinely rehabilitative. After directing loving kindness toward oneself, the practice extends outward, to a loved one, to a neutral person, to a difficult person, and eventually to all beings everywhere. The extension to a neutral person, someone neither loved nor disliked, someone you see regularly but think little about, is particularly interesting. Most anxious minds are almost entirely absorbed in the small circle of people and situations that are directly relevant to their own story. The neutral person practice begins to stretch that circle, to make the world slightly larger, the self slightly smaller, and in making the self smaller, its worries proportionally less overwhelming. The extension to the difficult person, the person toward whom resentment or fear is carried, is where the most significant work happens and where the most significant relief becomes available. There is a specific practice recommended in the Theravada tradition for working with the anxious mind late at night, the time when overthinking typically reaches its most intense and most irrational expression. Before sleep, review the day, not with judgment, not with the harsh inner critic, but with the gentle honesty of someone taking an honest inventory. What went well today? What was I genuinely grateful for? Where did I act in alignment with my values? Where did I act from fear or confusion? Not to punish, to acknowledge, to understand, and then to release with the deliberate act of letting the day be done. This practice, secular versions of which appear in gratitude journaling and cognitive processing therapy, is essentially a nightly return of the mind to its natural state of equanimity before sleep. The practice of mantra, the repetition of a word or phrase as an object of meditation, is used across multiple Buddhist traditions as a specific tool for the busy, anxious mind. The logic is pragmatic rather than mystical. The mind needs something to hold on to as an alternative to the thought loop, and a word or phrase is more portable and more immediately available than the breath. In Tibetan practice, the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, associated with compassion, is perhaps the most widely used. In other traditions, simple phrases in the practitioner's own language serve equally well. Breathing in peace, breathing out release, or simply here, now, here, now. The repetition creates a rhythm, and rhythm, whether in music, in breath, or in language, has a measurable calming effect on the nervous system that functions entirely independently of what one believes about the words being repeated. One of the most immediately useful practices for interrupting the anxiety loop in the middle of daily life is what mindfulness teachers call the stop practice. Stop, literally, stop whatever you're doing for 30 seconds. Take a breath, one full, deliberate, conscious breath, feeling it all the way in and all the way out. Observe. What is happening in the body right now? Where is the tension? What is the quality of the breath? What are the most prominent thoughts? And then proceed, return to whatever you were doing, but with a slightly different quality of awareness than you had before the stop. The entire practice takes 30 to 60 seconds and can be done anywhere at any time, without any equipment and without anyone else knowing it is happening. The concept of beginner's mind, Shoshin in Zen Buddhism, is one of the most powerful antidotes to the anxious mind's tendency to project known patterns onto unknown situations. The famous teacher Shunryu Suzuki wrote, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." The anxious mind is the opposite of beginner's mind. It approaches every new situation with a long list of how things went wrong before, how things might go wrong again, and what the threat level of the current moment is based on patterns from the past. Beginner's mind meets each moment as if for the first time, not naively, not without learning from experience, but with genuine openness to the possibility that this moment is different from every previous moment. Because it is, every moment is, and that newness, when genuinely seen rather than covered over by the mind's compulsive pattern matching, is one of the most consistently accessible experiences of freedom available in ordinary life. The practice of noble silence, periods of deliberate abstention from unnecessary speech, is used in Buddhist retreats for a specific reason that applies directly to the anxious mind. Much of the thought loop is sustained and fed by the habitual narration of experience, the constant internal and external commentary on what is happening, what it means, what should be done about it. Noble silence creates the conditions in which that narration simply has nowhere to go, and in that unusual space, something becomes visible that the narration had been covering. The quality of the present moment without the commentary on the present moment. For people who have been running the commentary so long they no longer notice it, even a single hour of deliberately reducing internal and external speech can be revelatory. The instruction to practice generosity, dana, as a tool for working with the anxious, self-focused mind, is one of the most consistently underestimated practical suggestions in all of Buddhist teaching. Anxiety is, at its structural core, a contraction of awareness around the self and its concerns, a narrowing of the frame of reference to the point where the self's worries fill the entire visible horizon. Deliberate generosity, giving time, attention, resources, or skill to others without expectation of return, expands that contracted frame. It moves the center of gravity of awareness, however briefly, from the self and its problems to another person and their needs. And in that movement, however small, however temporary, the self-referential loop must pause, and in that pause, relief is available. There is a practical tool from the Zen tradition that is particularly useful for the anxious mind's tendency to catastrophize, to see the worst possible outcome as the most probable one. The tool is simply this. Ask in genuine honesty, what is the worst that can actually happen? And then ask with equal honesty, can I handle that? Most anxious people avoid this question because they are afraid that honestly considering the worst case will make it more real or more likely. In practice, the opposite tends to be true. When the worst case is honestly named and honestly examined, it loses the quality of unnameable terror that sustains the anxiety around it. The named fear is almost always smaller and more manageable than the unnamed one, and the question, can I handle that, answered honestly, almost always receives a surprising and relieving answer. The practice of gratitude, systematically noticing and naming what is genuinely good in the present moment, is recommended across virtually every Buddhist tradition as a foundation for mental health. Not toxic positivity, not the denial of genuine difficulty, the deliberate, honest recognition of what is actually present and actually good alongside whatever difficulty is also present. The anxious mind has an extreme negativity bias. It notices and amplifies threat signals and tends to filter out or take for granted positive ones. Gratitude practice is not a correction of that bias through false positivity. It is a correction through genuine attention to what the negativity bias has been systematically ignoring. What is warm? What is beautiful? What is working? What is held? What is here that would be missed if it were gone? Sangha, community, the third of the three jewels of Buddhism alongside the Buddha and the Dharma, is a practical tool for the anxious mind that is frequently overlooked in the era of solo meditation apps. The anxious, overthinking mind tends toward isolation. The loop thrives in private, in the echo chamber of a single mind with no external reality check. A community of practitioners, even a small one, even an imperfect one, provides the reality check, the accountability, the companionship, and the shared wisdom that the isolated, anxious mind cannot provide for itself. Others who are practicing the same path have navigated the same territory and survived the same doubts, and their company is, in itself, a form of teaching. The Buddha did not teach in isolation. He taught in community, and the consistent testimony of practitioners across all traditions is that genuine, sustained transformation is significantly harder without it. One final practical tool deserves mention, and it is perhaps the simplest, most accessible, and most consistently underestimated of all the Buddhist prescriptions for the anxious mind. Rest. Genuine, deliberate, unapologetic rest. Not the collapse of exhaustion. Not the distracted half-rest of scrolling a phone in bed, the deliberate setting down of effort, of the need to accomplish, to solve, to manage, to prepare. The Buddha built rest into the schedule of monastic life, not as a concession to weakness, but as a recognition that the mind cannot sustain quality awareness without genuine recovery. The anxious mind treats rest as a luxury it has not earned and cannot afford. The Buddhist teaching says, rest is the ground from which clear action grows, and without the ground, there is only the frantic, exhausting, ultimately unproductive running. The tools in this part of the video are not a menu from which you pick your favorites and ignore the rest. They work as an ecosystem, each one supporting the others, each one strengthening the capacity that makes the others more accessible. Sitting practice builds the awareness that makes walking meditation genuine. Walking meditation builds the presence that makes body awareness possible. Body awareness makes emotion easier to hold. Holding emotion easier makes metta more accessible. And metta, genuine, practiced, expansive, loving kindness, changes the entire emotional climate in which all the other practices operate. Begin somewhere. Begin with one practice, practiced consistently, practiced humbly, practiced without the expectation of immediate dramatic results. The results come, they always come, but they come the way a tree grows, invisibly, steadily beneath the surface, until one day you look up and the shade is real. There is a teaching in Buddhism that is sometimes called environmental dharma, the recognition that the external conditions of a person's life are not irrelevant to their inner practice. The Buddha was precise about this. He taught that certain environments support the development of awareness and equanimity, and certain environments actively undermine it. This is not a call to flee the world into a monastery, though for some people, at some stages, that withdrawal is genuinely valuable. It is a recognition that the person who wants to build a quieter, more spacious inner life cannot treat the structure of their daily existence as irrelevant to that goal. The outer life and the inner life are not separate systems. They are one continuous reality, and tending to both is not optional. It is the practice. The principle of sila, ethical conduct, is not primarily a moral requirement in the Buddhist framework, though it has moral dimensions. It is described in the earliest texts as the foundation that makes samadhi, stable, clear concentration, possible. And samadhi is the foundation that makes panna, wisdom, the direct insight that liberates, possible. The reason ethical conduct supports inner quiet is direct and practical. The person who has acted in ways that harm others carries a residue of guilt, vigilance, and self-protective anxiety that no meditation technique can fully dissolve. The mind that is at peace with its own behavior does not need to maintain constant vigilance against the inner critic, and that freed energy becomes available for practice. Simplicity, the reduction of unnecessary complexity from the structure of daily life, is one of the most consistently recommended environmental conditions in Buddhist teaching. The anxious mind generates most of its fuel from complexity. Too many commitments, too many open loops, too many partially begun projects and unfinished conversations and delayed decisions. Each open loop occupies a small portion of cognitive bandwidth, not enough to deal with, but enough to generate a low background hum of unease. Deliberately closing loops, making the decision, finishing the conversation, saying no to the new commitment, simplifying the schedule, reduces the total load the mind is carrying. And a mind carrying less weight has more capacity for the quality of attention that practice requires. The Buddha's instruction on right speech, one of the factors of the Eightfold Path, has direct implications for the anxious mind that most teachings on the topic miss. Right speech includes not only the obvious prescriptions against lying and harsh speech, but also a less obvious one, not speaking of what does not concern you. The anxious mind is frequently drawn into conversations about other people's problems, other people's choices, and other people's business, not from genuine compassion, but from the displacement of its own unexamined anxiety. Every minute spent in that kind of speech is a minute not spent dealing with what is actually present in one's own experience. And the habit of not examining one's own experience, of always looking elsewhere, is exactly the habit that the overthinking loop requires to sustain itself. The relationship to digital technology, and specifically to the habitual checking of phones, social media, and news, deserves specific and honest attention in the context of the anxious mind. The Buddha could not have anticipated the smartphone, but the principle he would apply is straightforward. Whatever consistently pulls the mind toward agitation, comparison, and worry is worth examining carefully. Social media for most regular users generates a regular stream of comparison, outrage, fear, and the particular anxiety of following news cycles that create urgency without offering any available action. None of this is a moral judgment about technology. It is a practical assessment of what it does to the quality of attention and the emotional climate of the mind. The person who notices that their digital habits are feeding their anxiety and does nothing to change them is not a victim of technology. They are making a choice that deserves honest recognition as a choice. Sleep, the subject touched on briefly in the body section, deserves expanded treatment here as a structural life condition. The Buddha's monastic schedule was organized around sleep in a way that modern life almost entirely disregards: early to bed, with genuine darkness and quiet for a substantial portion of the night. Modern research on sleep has confirmed what any honest person knows from experience. Below about 7 hours of sleep for most adults, the emotional regulatory capacity of the prefrontal cortex is significantly impaired. Below 6 hours, the impairment begins to resemble the effects of mild alcohol intoxication, including reduced capacity to accurately assess risk, increased emotional reactivity, and decreased ability to interrupt automatic responses. The chronically sleep-deprived, anxious mind is not working at anything close to the capacity needed for the practices described in this video. And treating sleep as optional is treating the foundation of the building as optional. Nature, the direct, unmediated experience of the natural world, is mentioned throughout the Buddhist texts as a supportive condition for the development of clear awareness. The Buddha himself found his enlightenment not in a city, but in a forest. He taught consistently in natural settings: parks, groves, gardens. The texts describe nature not as a backdrop, but as a teacher. Impermanence is visible in every falling leaf, every cloud formation, every river moving toward a sea it will never reach as the same water. Modern research consistently finds that time spent in natural environments reduces cortisol, reduces ruminative thought, reduces amygdala activation, and increases the quality of attention. For the anxious person, this research is not an interesting curiosity, it is a practical prescription. Spend regular time outside, away from screens and noise, in the presence of the unconditioned world that exists entirely without reference to your worries. The relationship with a teacher, a genuinely experienced practitioner who has walked the path further than you have, is described in the Buddhist texts as one of the most powerful environmental conditions for inner development. The Buddha said, when asked if good friendship was half of the holy life, no, good friendship is the whole of it. This is a startling statement from a tradition so often associated with solitary inner practice, and it points at something real. The mind alone cannot fully see its own blind spots. The loop is invisible from inside the loop. And a skilled teacher, not a guru to be followed blindly but an experienced companion on the road, can see from outside what the person inside cannot. Not everyone has access to a traditional teacher, but the principle still applies. Find people who are practicing honestly and learn from them directly, not just from books or videos. The practice of work as meditation, sometimes called right livelihood in action, is one of the most underappreciated tools for the anxious mind in daily life. Most people experience their work as either a source of anxiety or a distraction from it, rarely as a practice in its own right. But any work, any at all, can be done with or without mindful awareness. Any repetitive task can be a body scan. Any conversation can be a metta practice. Any decision can be a moment of clear, honest, non-reactive observation. The Zen tradition makes this explicit in the famous instruction, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The wood and the water are the same. The quality of attention brought to them is different, and that difference is the practice. The practice of sitting with uncertainty, deliberately, consciously, without trying to resolve it, is perhaps the most advanced and most necessary life skill for the chronically anxious person. Anxiety is, at its structural core, the mind's inability to tolerate uncertainty, the desperate reach for a certainty that life, by its nature, cannot reliably provide. The Zen tradition has a practice called sitting with koans, paradoxical questions that cannot be resolved by the thinking mind, specifically to develop the capacity to remain present and stable in the face of irresolvable unknowing. The skill built by sitting with a koan is the same skill needed to face the uncertainty of health, of relationships, of livelihood, of life itself. The capacity to stay present and grounded when the mind does not know the answer and cannot force one. That capacity, built in practice, tested in life, deepened over time, is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is the development of a self large enough to contain it without being destroyed by it. The practice of review at the end of the day, sitting for 5 minutes before sleep and honestly assessing what happened, creates an important quality of integrity in the relationship with oneself. Not a harsh inventory, not a tribunal, the kind of honest, warm, interested review that a thoughtful friend might offer after a shared day. What did I do that I am genuinely glad I did? Where did I act from my best self? Where did I act from fear, from habit, from the automatic reaction, rather than the considered response? And most importantly, what do I want to carry forward from today into tomorrow? And what do I want to consciously, deliberately, gently lay down? The Buddhist teaching on right livelihood, that the work through which one makes a living should not contradict the inner practice, is often applied too narrowly as a list of forbidden occupations. The deeper application is this: work that requires the constant performance of emotions you do not feel, constant self-betrayal in the service of approval, constant suppression of genuine values. That work extracts a cost from the inner life that no salary can repay. This is not idealism. It is a practical recognition that integrity and inner health are not separable. The person who spends 40 hours a week acting against their genuine values and then tries to practice peace in the remaining time is working against themselves in a way that makes both the work and the practice worse. The aspiration is not a perfect life. It is a life that even imperfectly creates more conditions for awareness than it destroys. Ritual, in the broad, secular sense of intentional, repeated action that marks transitions and creates structure, is a tool for the anxious mind that modern life has largely abandoned and genuinely misses. A morning ritual that does not begin with a phone creates a different quality of attention for the first hour of the day than one that does. An evening ritual that marks the end of work, genuinely, not just by changing rooms, signals to the nervous system that the vigilance required for work is no longer required. The repetition is not the point. The quality of intention and attention that repetition creates over time is the point. And quality of intention, sustained through consistent daily structure, is what separates the person who occasionally manages their anxiety from the person who has actually changed their relationship to it. The practice of dana, generosity, as a daily life structure rather than an occasional gesture, is described in the Buddhist texts as having a specific effect on the quality of the inner life. The person who regularly, habitually, unremarkably gives time, attention, skill, resources to others without keeping an internal score develops a quality of expansiveness that is the structural opposite of the anxious contraction. The anxious mind hoards time, energy, attention, possibilities, contingency plans against an uncertain future. The generous mind opens, and in opening discovers that what was hoarded was not making it safer, it was making it smaller. This is not a teaching about sacrifice. It is a teaching about what actually creates the feeling of sufficiency that the anxious mind is always searching for and never quite finding. One of the most often cited barriers to practice, and one of the most honest, is lack of time. The honest response to this barrier from the Buddhist tradition is not a productivity strategy. It is a question: what, if you look honestly at how time is actually spent, are you doing in that time that is more important than reducing the suffering of the mind that is present for every moment of your life? Not to produce guilt, to produce genuine honesty about priorities and about whether the life currently being lived reflects what is actually most valued. The Buddha said, "The human lifetime is precious and finite, and it passes without pausing to ask whether you are ready. Use it." The tendency of the anxious mind to treat practice as something to be done perfectly or not at all deserves specific, direct address. There is no perfect practice. There is only the practice that actually happens, imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes barely recognizable as practice at all. 5 distracted minutes of sitting are better than 0 minutes of sitting. A half-conscious breath taken in the middle of a stressful meeting is better than no breath at all. The all-or-nothing quality of the perfectionist anxious mind is itself one of the loop's most reliable strategies for preventing the practice that would interrupt it. Practice badly, practice inconsistently, practice with the half-hearted, distracted, imperfect mind you actually have. Because that mind, practiced with regularly, becomes gradually and reliably clearer. The teaching of patience, Kshanti in Sanskrit, is one of the 6 perfections in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition and one of the most directly applicable to the experience of working with an anxious mind. Patience does not mean passive acceptance of everything. It means the capacity to remain present and equanimous in the face of difficulty, discomfort, and the frustratingly slow pace of genuine transformation. The anxious mind wants results immediately, which is itself an expression of the anxiety. The practice is taking too long. Am I doing it right? Why is it not working yet? The answer to all of these questions is the same: patience, not as a virtue to be achieved, but as a practice to be cultivated alongside everything else. The tree does not grow faster because you pull at it, but it grows, reliably, surely, invisibly, when it is given the conditions it needs, consistently, without demanding results on a timeline of your choosing. Community, Sangha, as a structural feature of daily life, means more than attending occasional group meditation. It means building relationships with people who are asking the same questions, practicing in the same direction, and willing to hold genuine, honest, supportive conversations about the inner life. The anxious mind is particularly prone to isolation, to the conviction that its particular form of struggle is too private, too shameful, or too unusual to share with others. That conviction is almost always wrong, and the moment it is tested, the moment the struggle is named honestly in the presence of another practicing human being, the isolation that sustains it begins to dissolve. You do not have to practice alone. You were never supposed to practice alone. That is why the Buddha made community one of the 3 jewels. The question of how long the path takes, how long before genuine relief from chronic anxiety is available, is one of the most common and most understandable questions that practitioners ask. The honest answer given by every serious teacher across every tradition is, it varies enormously, and comparison is not useful. What is consistent is this: some relief is available from the first moments of genuine practice. Not complete relief, but real relief, a perceptible decrease in the intensity of the loop, a slight widening of the space between stimulus and reaction. That initial relief, however small, is the confirmation that the direction is right and the invitation to continue. The path is long for most people. It is also the only one that actually leads somewhere, and every honest step on it, however imperfect, however small, is already an arrival. The life that supports inner quiet is not a perfect life. It is not a life without difficulty, without conflict, without the recurrence of difficult thoughts and difficult emotions. It is a life that has been deliberately, honestly, imperfectly shaped around the aspiration for genuine awareness. And that aspiration, held consistently over time, changes everything it touches. Not because the world changes, because the one who meets the world changes. The anxious mind that has been honestly practiced with, honestly sat with, honestly befriended rather than fought, is not the same mind it was before. It is quieter, it is kinder to itself, it is more spacious. And in that spaciousness, whatever the weather outside, something is available that was not available before, something that the tradition simply calls peace. We started this video with a question that almost every person who finds their way to this content is asking. Why can I not make my mind stop? Why does the worry return the moment I manage to quiet it? Why does the peace I find in certain moments not stay? The answer, the real answer, not the reassuring one, is because you have been looking for peace in the wrong direction. You have been looking for it in the future, in the solved version of the current problem, in the imagined arrival of the circumstances you have been waiting for. And peace was never there. Peace has only ever been here, in this moment, in this breath, in the awareness that was present before the first anxious thought arose this morning. Everything we have covered in this video, the loop, the body, the tools, the structure of daily life, all of it points at one thing. Not a technique, not a belief, not a state to be achieved through sufficient effort. A recognition, a seeing, the simplest and most demanding thing a human mind can do. The recognition that the awareness in which thoughts arise is not made of thoughts, and that awareness prior to the content it holds is already quiet, already whole, already sufficient, already at peace in a way that no thought can create and no thought can destroy. The Buddha described what he found under the Bodhi tree with many words across many teachings. But one of the most simple and most startling descriptions was this: I was searching everywhere for the builder of the house. I have found you now. You shall build no more. The house is the constructed self. The personality, the story, the system of beliefs and habitual reactions that presents itself as the real me. The builder is craving, the reaching, the grasping, the relentless construction of experiences to make the self feel safe, significant, and secure. And when the builder is found, clearly seen for what it is, the compulsive building stops, and what remains without the building is already home. The anxious mind is, at its deepest level, a mind that does not feel at home, a mind that believes, somewhere beneath all the reasons and all the logic, that it is not safe, that it does not belong, that the peace it is looking for is always just around the corner but never quite here. Buddhism says that belief is the one that needs examining, not the anxious thoughts. Those are symptoms. The root belief that this moment, this life, this self is not sufficient as it is, that is the root of the loop. And examining it, honestly, gently, persistently, with the openness of someone who genuinely wants to know rather than someone who already has the answer, is the root of the path. The overthinking mind, when genuinely understood rather than judged, is a mind that cares deeply. It worries about health because health matters. It rehearses conversations because relationships matter. It anticipates problems because it wants to be prepared, to be adequate, to not be taken by surprise. The caring is not the problem. The problem is that the caring has been routed through a system, the anxious, proliferating, future-projecting mind that is not capable of satisfying the care it is expressing. The system is not the right tool for the job it has been given, and changing the system, not the caring but the system, is what Buddhist practice makes possible. So, the first thing to say to your own anxious mind, sincerely without condescension, is thank you for caring. Now let me show you a better way to care. The quieter mind that practice builds is not a mind that cares less. In virtually every account from long-term practitioners across all Buddhist traditions, the opposite is consistently reported. The mind that is less driven by anxiety is more genuinely present, more genuinely available to the people and situations it actually cares about. Less of its energy is consumed by the loop, which means more energy is available for genuine attention, genuine engagement, genuine compassion. The quieter mind does not love less. It loves more honestly, without the fear that distorts love into control, and without the grasping that turns love into another form of anxiety. The journey from a chronically anxious mind to a genuinely quieter one is not a straight line. There will be periods of genuine progress, days and weeks when the loop is quieter, when the body is more relaxed, when the quality of presence improves visibly. And there will be periods of regression, when a stressful event or a difficult season pulls the old patterns back with unexpected force. Buddhism does not call these regressions failures. It calls them the practice, the actual living, breathing practice, not the version that happens when conditions are ideal. The measure of progress is not the absence of difficult days. It is the speed with which the mind recovers its ground after being pulled from it. There is a teaching from the Japanese Zen tradition that has accompanied practitioners through centuries of difficulty. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. Not as a motivational slogan, as an actual precise description of what practice looks like in the face of the real obstacles a real human life consistently presents. You will forget to practice. You will have days when the anxiety is as intense as it ever was. You will lie awake at 3 in the morning and wonder if any of this is working. And then, the next morning or the morning after, you will sit down, take one breath and begin again. Because the path is not a problem to be solved once. It is a direction to be walked, one step at a time, for as long as it takes. The unresolved question we leave you with, the one that is meant to stay open, to work on you gently in the days ahead, is this. The awareness that is reading these words right now, the presence that has been here throughout this entire video, watching thoughts arise and watching them pass. What is the quality of that awareness? Not its contents, not the thoughts and feelings moving through it, the awareness itself. Is it anxious? Is it contracted? Is it grasping at something or pushing something away? Or is it, when genuinely attended to apart from its contents, something surprisingly quiet, surprisingly spacious, surprisingly already at peace with what is here? That quiet, if you found even a breath of it in that question, is not something that was created by the question. It was here before the question. It was here before the first anxious thought arose this morning. It has been here through every moment of every difficulty you have ever experienced, the ground beneath the storm, unaffected by the storm. Finding it, recognizing it, learning to return to it, that is not the end of the practice. It is the beginning of the real one. And the beginning of the real practice is available right now, in this moment, with the mind you already have. This video has traveled a long way from the question of the mind that will not stop, through the loop and how it works, through the body and what it holds, through the tools and how to use them, through the structure of a life that supports what you are trying to build. But all of it was always pointing at the same thing, the space between thoughts that the thoughts themselves are pointing away from. That space, available in every breath, in every pause between words, in every moment when the loop pauses before the next thought arrives, that space is not empty. It is full of the kind of quiet that does not need the noise to stop in order to be there. Every person who has ever seriously sat with their own mind and survived what they found there has a contribution to make to this conversation. Not the experts alone. Not the teachers alone. The person who sat for 5 minutes this morning and barely managed to feel one breath before the thoughts took over. That person too. Because that 5 minutes, imperfect as it was, is evidence that the direction exists, that the quiet is there even when almost invisible. And evidence of the direction, however small, however brief, is the most important thing any human being navigating an anxious life can have. You are that evidence. Your continuing to try is that evidence, and that is worth more than any amount of perfect practice done by someone else. To the person watching this who has been struggling with anxiety and overthinking for years, sometimes decades, this part is specifically for you. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are not more broken than the practice can reach. The fact that you are here, watching a video this long about this topic, is itself evidence of something in you that refuses to give up on the possibility of genuine relief. That refusal is not stubbornness, it is wisdom. The oldest wisdom the human species has, the recognition that suffering is not the final answer and that the door is not locked. It is not locked. It has never been locked. And you have been approaching it, perhaps more steadily than you realize, all along. The Buddha's final instruction to his students, his last words before he died, was not a philosophical statement or a cosmological claim. It was a practical instruction, given with the same directness that had characterized 45 years of teaching. He said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. Not your neighbor's salvation, not the salvation of the idea of you that others carry. Your salvation, the genuine, lived, daily, moment-by-moment liberation of the mind you actually have from the suffering you actually experience. With diligence, not perfection, not dramatic renunciation. Diligence, steady, humble, consistent, and genuinely committed engagement with the practice, one ordinary day at a time. The thought we leave you with is genuinely open. It is meant to be lived with, rather than answered. If the quiet we have been pointing at all along is not something to be created, but something to be recognized, what would it take to recognize it more often? Not in a special state, not after 20 years of practice, not after the problems have been solved, but in this moment, exactly as this moment is difficult, uncertain, imperfect, and completely sufficient. What would it take? We do not know your specific situation. We do not know the particular shape that the anxiety takes in your life or how long you have been carrying it. But we know this, with the certainty that comes from 25 centuries of careful human investigation into this exact territory. The quiet is real, the path to it is real, and you are capable of walking it. Not someday, not eventually, not after you have prepared enough. Now and now and now again. One breath at a time, one honest moment of seeing at a time, one choice between the automatic reaction and the conscious response. At a time. That is the entire path, and the entire path is available in the next breath you take. This video was built for you, for the specific kind of person who takes their inner life seriously enough to spend 2 hours exploring what the oldest, most carefully tested wisdom traditions have to say about the mind that will not stop. That seriousness is not a burden, it is a gift, to yourself and to everyone whose life touches yours. The calmer you become, genuinely, not performatively, the more genuinely present you are available to be for the people you love, for the work that matters to you, for the moments that deserve your full and undivided attention rather than the fraction left over after the loop has taken its share. This is why the inner work is not selfish. It is, in the deepest sense, the most generous thing you can do. The tradition of Buddhism that we have drawn on throughout this video is not a closed system. It is an invitation to look, to question, to test in your own experience, to trust what you find there, rather than what you are told to find. The Buddha himself said, "Do not believe something because a teacher told you, or because it is written in a scripture, or because it sounds reasonable. Believe what you have tested in your own experience and found to be true, helpful, and conducive to the reduction of suffering." That standard, radical, empirical, and genuinely respectful of your own capacity to know, is the standard we hope you will apply to everything in this video. If this video gave you something, one idea, one tool, one moment of recognition, one breath taken more consciously than the one before, please like it now. That single action tells us that this kind of honest, deep, unhurried exploration is what you want more of on this channel, and it makes it possible for us to keep creating it. Share this with one person in your life who you know is running the loop, who lies awake at night, who rehearses the conversations, who is exhausted by their own mind. This might be exactly the thing they have been looking for without knowing where to look, and you sharing it is itself an act of metta, of loving kindness, in the most practical and immediate sense. Subscribe to Wisdom Woven if you have not already, because everything ahead on this channel is built on the same commitment: depth over surface, honesty over comfort, and the conviction that your inner life is worth taking seriously. Leave a comment below, and not just any comment. Tell us what changed for you in this video, not what you thought was interesting. What changed? What do you see differently about your own mind? What question are you walking away with that you did not have when you arrived? We read every single comment on this channel, because your experience of this material is not separate from the teaching, it is part of it. And the conversation in the comments, the honest, searching, imperfect, genuinely human conversation, is one of the things that makes this channel and this community worth continuing to build.